King Edward VIII, centre of the greatest storm in Britain since the World War. Opposed to the popular ruler's desire to marry Mrs. Walter Simpson, strides Premier Stanley Baldwin. No marriage to Mrs. Simpson, Stanley Baldwin says, speaking for the British government. Here he is in typical action.
Government is a great idea.
Today in Britain's new crisis, the Premier proves that he has lost no force. Mrs. Simpson replies with a formal offer to give up the king, withdraw from the tempest which sweeps the empire, leave Edward safe upon his throne.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Walter Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman and a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne. So it really split the country down the middle. And of course, the upper classes were faced with this completely different idea, whereby they didn't condemn him from a moral perspective. They condemned him more from a perspective of being selfish enough to having put the country in this constitutional crisis.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Even the whole sense of theatre leading up to it, he was driven down the long drive, the long walk at Windsor. He went to his old suite of rooms at Windsor and sat behind his desk. And what he delivered was heartfelt. What he was saying is, I love this woman so much, I simply cannot exist without her. I won't be an effective king without her, whereas my brother has this very loyal wife and will be a better king. And I think there's great dignity in his abdication speech. And I think that the reason it resonated so hugely the world over and has done, for the last 80 years, is because he spoke from the heart and he spoke his truth. And that was a very non-British, non-royal thing to do.
When he made his abdication speech from Windsor Castle on the evening of 11th December 1936, people were listening to it all over the country, they were weeping. It was a huge national moment because no king had ever abdicated before. And the fact that he was doing so for love, or at least what appeared to be love, made people feel this was a great sentimental passion. And I think what it did, and I think there's always been a romantic way of looking at the abdication crisis, is that Edward had acted in a way that, on the one hand, was appallingly entirely selfish. On the other hand, it was a way that has torn up centuries of precedent. All of his forebears had essentially known that to be king was something that you did as a duty, your personal feelings didn't really matter. So what he said was actually, no, my feelings and my happiness are more important than my being king. So I think people responded to that, and I think that the public had this sympathy for him. Stanley Baldwin proposed something which had never before happened in Britain. It was known as a morganatic, or colloquially, a left-handed marriage. This was something that had happened in Europe, but had never happened before in Britain because it was seen as somehow inappropriate. But a morganatic marriage was essentially a marriage that took place between a king or a queen and somebody of lower social status. And the idea would be that while the husband or wife was acknowledged as a husband or wife, they would never be called king or queen. They wouldn't even be called prince or princess. And this was thought temporarily to have been a good idea, but Baldwin's cabinet would not stand it. And although Baldwin at one point suggested that he might resign if it did not go through, no such threat was called out. So in fact, Baldwin was able to suggest this quite unprecedented idea. It didn't happen, and it went back into its box again.
The greatest myth about Wallis Simpson is that it's been convenient for history to paint her as the wicked witch in this and the woman that pushed for abdication. That is the biggest lie. There is absolute concrete evidence from her friends, from her letters, from her own memoir, that she absolutely did not want the king to abdicate, that she begged him not to abdicate, that she was desperate to, as she said, slip away and fold my tent. And when she tried to escape him prior to the abdication and say, look, please don't do this, I shall watch you from afar, you can be an effective king. Essentially, he said, wherever you go in the world, I shall follow you. And just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalté to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallis and said, if you leave me, I shall kill myself. And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage. And she just couldn't risk that. So she could not escape. But for anyone to say that Wallis Simpson wanted to be queen, that she wanted Edward to abdicate, is an utter falsehood.
Wallis did not want Edward to abdicate for the very simple reason that Wallis was terrified of what was going to happen to her. She enjoyed being the mistress of the Prince of Wales. She enjoyed the financial advantages it gave her, the social advantages it gave her, the gifts that were lavished upon her, the fact that she could live in the life and the style that she'd always been accustomed to. But as Edward's reign went on, she began to get more and more frightened because she was the subject of personal abuse. The house she was living in Regent's Park had its windows smashed. There was the constant worry that she was going to be attacked or worse. And she began to feel, by the time of the abdication crisis, that she did not want to be embroiled in this. So she actually fled to France when it was at its peak. And she tried very, very hard to give Edward up. But Edward would not give her up.
It's a really interesting question. Was the abdication a difficult decision for Edward? Because in one sense, it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything. It meant more than the monarchy, his seat at the throne, all of that. However, for a man like that who'd been brought up in that household, obviously to abdicate was the most seismic, devastating event. And I think he genuinely felt terrible at letting the people who loved him down. I don't think it was a question of he felt guilt at betraying the palace or Parliament, because I think he felt they had betrayed him, actually. So it's a complex answer. Because he was so heart-led, it wasn't a difficult decision because his heart led the way. But I think in his head, obviously, there must have been conflict. And he loved his brother, and he knew the strain he was then going to be putting onto his brother. But as he said, Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. And in fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king. But for me, it's incredibly tragic, because as we saw when he was governor of the Bahamas, I truly believe that had he been allowed to have Wallis by his side, he would have been a better king.
After the abdication, Edward left Britain for Europe. He travelled to Austria. He had to wait 6 months to be reunited with Wallis, and that was because Wallis's divorce had to be finalised.
When Edward and Wallis were finally reunited at the Chateau Candé in France, it's really very moving. I mean, he just rushed up the steps to be with her, and they were so tender at that stage because it really was them against the world.
The British press go wild. They've followed this story. They've waited for this moment of reunion, and there are front page photographs and headlines celebrating the fact that these two lovers are back together again.